thousands. I get it. You can go up. You can go up. No, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, if you're late, you'll just miss it. No. You guys are great. Hey, Tim.
God sends You guys can see it. Thanks, Tracy.
Just hit the house.
Thank you, Jess. This is the week 2 Advent reading for December 10th. During this Advent season, we come to worship and adore Jesus. He is majestic, he is full of compassion, he is humble, and he offers us forgiveness. As we light the candles today, we continue our journey to Christmas, looking forward to the day when Christ will bring his perfect peace that passes all understanding. As we live in a world filled with chaos and conflict, we do so with confidence, knowing that he is the source of ultimate and everlasting peace.
The scriptures are full of reminders of the peace he offers. Psalm 4:8 reads, "In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, will make me dwell in safety. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end." Isaiah 9:10. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward all men. Luke 2:14. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. John 14:27.
Today, as we relight the hope candle, and as we light the peace candle, we remember that Christ alone is our source of true peace. We remember our need for a Savior to deliver us from our sins and give us peace with God, the peace our hearts are designed for. We remember that God of peace becomes our Prince of Peace. He came not as a conquering warrior, but as a peaceful babe in a manger. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Tell them this familiar story, and as they get set, we're gonna sing really a song that encapsulates what we're doing this morning. We're coming here to worship Him.
Everything was ready. The moment God had been waiting for was here at last. God was coming to help his people just as he had promised in the beginning. But how would he come? What would he be like? What would he do? Mountains would have bowed down. Seas would have roared. Trees would have clapped their hands. But the earth held its breath. As silent as snow falling, he came in. And when no one was looking, in the darkness, he came. There is a young girl who is engaged to a man named Joseph. One morning, this girl was minding her own business when suddenly a great warrior of light appeared, right there, in her bedroom. He was Gabriel, and he was an angel, a special messenger from heaven. Mary, Gabriel said, you're going to have a baby, a little boy. You will call him Jesus. He is God's own son. He is the one. He is the rescuer.
The God who flung planets into space and kept them whirling around in a round. The God who made the universe with just a word, and the one who could do anything at all, was making himself small and coming down as a baby.
But it's too wonderful, Mary said, with her heart beating hard. How can it be true? Is anything too wonderful for God? Gabriel asked. So Mary trusted God more than what her eyes could see, and she believed. I am God's servant, she said. Whatever God says, I will do.
Sure enough, it was just as the angel had said. 9 months later, Mary was
and Joseph had to take a trip to Bethlehem to be counted. But when they reached the little town, they found every room was full, every bed was taken. Go away, so the innkeepers told them. There isn't any place for you. They couldn't find anywhere except an old, tumble-down stable, so they stayed where the cows and donkeys and horses had stayed. And there, in the stable, amongst the chickens, the donkeys, and the cows, in the quiet of the night, God gave the world his wonderful gift. The baby that would change the world was born, his baby son. Mary and Joseph wrapped him up to keep him warm. They made a soft bed of straw and used animals' feeding trough as his cradle. And they gazed in wonder at God's great gift, wrapped in swaddling clothes behind the manger.
That same night, among the stars, suddenly a bright new star appeared. Of all the stars in the dark, vaulted heavens, this one shone clear. Blazed in the night and made the other stars appear beside it. God put it there when the sun was born, to be like a spotlight, shining out of him, lighting up the darkness, showing people the way to him.
Even for a raggedy old bunch of shepherds watching their sheep outside Bethlehem, you see, people thought shepherds were nobodies, just scruffy old riffraff. But God must have thought shepherds were very important. Important indeed, because they're the ones who chose to tell God news to first. They turned around and standing in front of them was a huge warrior of light blazing in the darkness. Don't be afraid of me, he said. I haven't come to hurt you. I've come to bring you happy news for everywhere. Today, in Bethlehem, God's son has been born. You can go see him.
Well, the shepherds stamped out their fire, left their sheep, and raced down to Bethlehem, until at last they reached a tumble-down stable. They caught their breath, they quietly tiptoed inside. They knelt on the dirt floor. They had heard about this promised child, and now he was here. This baby would be like the bright star shining in the night sky at night, a light to light up the world, chasing away the darkness, helping people to see. Meanwhile, far away in the east, 3 wise men saw a very same star, the star that God had put in the sky when Jesus was born. They knew it was a son. A baby king had been born. They had been waiting for the star. They knew it would come.
It's here, they shouted. It's here. At dawn, they packed up the camels and wrapped gifts for the baby. They brought the most precious treasures of all: frankincense, gold, and myrrh. Special, sparkly, lovely smelling, and gleaming things, just right for a king.
The 3 wise men set off. They rode their camels day and night until at last they reached Jerusalem. Jerusalem was by far the most important city for miles around, and as anyone can tell you, that's where a palace would be. After all, kings are born in palaces, so that's where they were, but they were in for a surprise.
They wanted to see King Herod. Surely he knew where the baby was, but he didn't. In fact, he didn't like the sound of a new king. It made him cross. He didn't want anyone to be king except him. So the 3 wise men kept following the star out of the big city to a little town of Bethlehem. They followed the star until it stopped right over on the street.
But wait, it wasn't a palace, and there weren't any guards, or servants, or flags, or red carpets, or trumpets. Did they get it wrong, or was this what God meant?
Sure enough, in the little stable, sitting on his mother's knee, they found the baby king. The 3 men stood before the little king. The king God had promised David all those who would be king. But this child was a new king. Though he was a prince of heaven, he had become poor. Though he was a mighty God, he had become a helpless baby. This king had come to be the boss. He had come to be a servant.
My God. I love that song. It contains the entirety of the gospel message, right? When we sing these words, we're getting those words deep into our heart, that Jesus is real, that he came to us in the flesh and longs to know us and to redeem us. That's such good news. Thanks, kids, for sharing. We're in the time in our worship service where we give an offering, and as we give this morning, I just kind of want to give you one brief update. As a part of our Journey Together 60th celebration, one of the things that we wanted to give towards was we wanted to partner with a ministry, and one of our partnerships in Columbia that we've sent several teams to had a need, and it's at Casa de Paz, and this is Casa de Paz, which is right outside of Medellin, Colombia, and several of our teams have gone to serve there. It is a home for boys. Their families have been displaced, and these families have said we really can't care for our kids, or maybe they do not have parents. And so there's 13 boys that live in this home, and they have several volunteers who on a rotational basis oversee all the boys. And you can imagine this home is filled with energy and joy. And when my boys were there this past summer, when we visited, they were so impressed because the boys did their own laundry. Fantastic, right? That's the only way to do that situation. But you know, if you're in my house, you're walking around and you're stepping over toys. At Casa de Paz, which means House of Peace, they really don't have a lot of those things, but the one thing they do have is a soccer field. And soccer, they play all the time. And Casa de Paz, and you'll notice it in this picture, is built on a hill. And so what is happening there is this Covenant Church went in, they built a soccer field, but now the rainwater is eroding all of that away. And so they really need an engineer to come in and build a water system so that it doesn't erode any more of their land away. And so as a part of our Journey Together campaign, we were able to send the first chunk of money, the first check down to them, so that they could now hire an engineer to start to design that system. In January, there's a week where the boys go and visit their homes. They go home for a week. And there will be a team of guys from a Covenant Church in Colombia that will go and install that system. And so this morning, we want to just invite you. We know that there's a lot of different ways that you can choose to give your money. There's a lot of different year-end projects. We want to make you aware of this need, that we want to close the gap. We're looking to send them $5,000, and the gap that we have right now is about $2,500. And so you can designate a gift this morning to Casa de Paz and this Columbia project, and we would love to see them get this need taken care of. It's been a joy for us to partner with our missionaries, Katie and Julio Izaza, but also to meet a real need at Casa de Paz. So as we give this morning, we give to programming in our church and ministry that happens in this building. We give to ministry that happens in our community, but also the partnerships that take place around the world. So we're grateful that in all of these things, we're in it together. So let's give generously.
Well, good morning, Roseville Covenant. It's so great to be together this morning. One more time, how awesome were those kids? I mean, they did that 2 times this morning, and I'm really impressed by their awesomeness. Well, we are currently in a series through Advent called Oh, Come Let Us Adore Him. And in this season of Advent, we are invited to worship the King, to anticipate the heavenly light entering the darkness of the world to bring us hope, peace, joy, and light. Throughout this series, we are looking at the characteristics of Christ present in both his birth as well as throughout his life on earth. He is majestic, he is full of compassion, he is humble, and he is forgiving. And this morning, we're going to talk about his compassion. So if you have your Bibles, or if you have a Pew Bible in front of you, you can turn to Matthew chapter 9. We're going to be in verses 35 through 38. And before you say it, I know it's Advent. Why are we in chapter 9? We'll get there, I promise. Chapter 9, verses 35 through 38 say this. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." Now, the word used for compassion in these verses only shows up in the New Testament 12 times. And in those 12 times, 3 of them are by Jesus himself in the parables of the forgiving master, the good Samaritan, and the prodigal son. And the other 9 times are said about Jesus when he's looking at people, either people in the crowds or people that he's about to heal. He feels compassion. And the original language of this word is kind of funny. Because what it actually means, literally, is that he was moved to his bowels. After first service, somebody came in and said, I only heard through the speakers, did you say bowels a lot in your sermon? Yes. Sit tight, we're going to say bowels a lot. When I first heard this word, I giggled because, junior high, and I didn't hear it in junior high, but it's that junior high sense of bowels. It's the thing that's inside of you. It's a weird word. I can see some of our nursing students smiling. You guys hear this word all the time. It's fine. But to be moved to your bowels, back in Jesus' day, they talked about that the seat of love in a person was in their innermost heart, in their gut. It's where the phrase gut-wrenching comes from. Feeling something to your bowels means that you feel it so deeply, it affects everything within you. And that's the word that is used 12 times in Matthew, Mark, and Luke about Jesus looking at people. That he's moved to this deep compassion in his bowels. And it's something that I can relate to. I think that's why I grab onto this word, because it's one of those moments in Jesus' life and ministry that as a human I can relate to because I felt that feeling. I know what it means to be moved so far down in my gut that it feels like my bowels are moving. And there is a scientific reasoning. One of my high schoolers told it to me in between services, and I probably have already forgotten it because I'm not really great at science. But there's a scientific reason as to why we feel this pain in our bowels when we see something that's not quite right. Matthew says that Jesus felt this way when he overlooked the crowds that he was teaching, because even though he had just been teaching, he'd gone from town to town and village to village, healing and preaching and telling people about the kingdom. He turned and he looked at all of this crowd following him, and he knew that there were still more towns and villages full of people that needed healing. And so he's moved because he knows that the job is still in front of him. This past week at youth group, we retold the Christmas story like we had this morning, and then we talked about what Jesus' world was like when he came. The world was full of oppression and marginalizations. The people, the Jewish people, were crying out to God because they hadn't heard from God in 400 years. They had all these prophecies. They knew that the Messiah was coming, but it had been years, generations, since they saw something happening. So when the angel comes to the shepherds are like, finally, God is sending the Messiah. We're finally going to get somewhere. And it's this same compassion that we talk about in Matthew that's been present throughout the story of God's people. It's the same compassion that every time the people of Israel cry out to God and he sends someone to help them. That compassion is in Egypt when the Israelites are in slavery and God sends Moses. It's the same compassion that creates a law, the 10 Commandments, that are meant to build community and protect the vulnerable, the fatherless, the widowed, the poor. It's the same compassion that protects the Israelites in exile when they're far away from their land and unable to worship their God in public. And it's the same compassion that God felt for his people in Rome and in Bethlehem when he sent his son on earth. This compassion has been here from the beginning. And as we talked about it this last week at youth group, I kept trying to help our kids understand that there was a darkness, a real darkness, that the people were living under. Because in Jesus' time, there were several things that kept people from being a part of the community, a part of who they were meant to be, to live in community with others. If they were sick, if a family member was sick, it meant that they couldn't be with the community. If they were a woman, it meant that they couldn't live in the same way that men in that time could. And Jesus comes into this story not just to be the Savior and the Messiah, although that is clearly enough, but he comes to take the system and to turn it on its head. To give dignity back to people who haven't had it for years. That's the compassion that Jesus has. Fast forward to this story in Matthew. Jesus has just been healing people, restoring them to the community, taking them out of the margins and back into community and society. And he looks over at the crowd and he sees that there's so much more work to do. And he's moved with compassion, that deep, deep sense of compassion. And here's what he does. He turns to his disciples. And he says to the disciples, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out more workers. I was reading a commentary this week by a Hispanic theologian named Justo Gonzalez. And Gonzalez says that if you were to read the book of Matthew from the beginning to this point and stop right before Jesus turns to his disciples, you would think that Jesus did all of these great things and then just abandoned us. But he turns to his disciples because Jesus knew that his life was going to be cut short and that if he didn't teach someone else to do this work, it wasn't going to continue. So this is the moment, Gonzalez says, that Jesus begins discipling the disciples. Because up until this point, only a few verses before this, is Matthew himself even called. Up until this point, I'm imagining the disciples are just following Jesus. Listening to his teachings, watching him heal people, in awe, yes. But at this point, they haven't been asked to do anything. And so Jesus turns to him and he shows the people. He points out to the crowd and he says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest to send more workers. And I'd like to think that in this moment, the disciples' eyes are finally opened. That maybe they start to feel this deep sense of compassion within themselves when they look out over all these people that need Jesus, that need the kingdom. Jesus says that they're helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Maybe the disciples are seeing that for the first time. And I think back the first time that I know that I felt this feeling. Our denomination does this journey. It's called Sankofa. And it's an intentionally cross-cultural prayer journey. And when I say that, I mean you get on a bus and you're paired with someone who's of a different ethnicity than you, and you travel through the South, and you go to all of these different sites from the Civil Rights Movement. And you're encouraged to dig deep into the history of America. And in this, on this journey, I remember a very distinct moment in the Civil Rights Museum. There's this jail cell that is set up in the Civil Rights Museum, and when you step into the jail cell, you hear a man's voice reading the letter from the Birmingham jail from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And if you're unfamiliar with this letter, what happened is that there had been a protest in Birmingham. Dr. Martin Luther King was there, he got arrested, and he was put into jail. And at the time, about 8 white clergymen wrote an open letter, basically to Dr. King, but also just an open letter to people around, and basically said, Dr. King, it's not the time. It's not the time to do what you're doing. And so from his jail cell in Birmingham, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote this letter back to the clergymen. And I stood inside of this jail cell, I still feel the feeling now. And I just started crying. Because the thing is when you stand in there and you hear the words of Dr. King in that moment, you can't help but be moved. Because he was being told, regardless of the fact that you have been oppressed for generations, it's not the time. And his words back to these clergymen are so elegant and empathetic. I would encourage you to Google it. It's online. You can read the whole thing. Read the letter back, because as I was reading it this week in preparation for this, I realized how much of it still rings true. But in that moment, 7 years ago, as I'm standing in that jail cell, I felt this deep sense within me that this is not okay. And I had to wrestle with what that meant. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But when I think back on that moment and countless other moments like this in my life, I think about the disciples that day with Jesus. And I think about how they looked over the crowds and they felt what Jesus was feeling toward the people. Jesus knew that the world that he was entering in, the world that we still live in today, is full of brokenness. It's full of oppressed people and marginalization, of poor and poverty. It is full of brokenness, and what Jesus knew is that every person on earth deserves the abundant life that he came to give. And the reason that he came to the shepherds, to the lowest group of people, is to show the world that everybody deserves what Jesus has to offer. Creatively and publicly, he took this compassion that he felt for the people and he turned it into mercy and justice. He healed people to bring them back to the community. And it exists in our world today. If you're anything like me, there are days that I'm scrolling through Facebook or Instagram or the news, or I'm watching the news, and I am just bombarded with all of the things that are wrong with this world, right? There are just countless number of things. And I can get overwhelmed because every one of those things makes me feel this feeling inside of me. Every one of those things deserves compassion and mercy and justice. And I am one person. I am a finite person with finite resources. But here's the beauty of creation. We are all created uniquely in the image of God. And we are all called uniquely. The same thing that moves me to the depths that I can't be silent about anymore may not be the thing for you. There may be something else, and the beauty of the kingdom and the way that we were created is that we are able to join together, whether we are working towards the same issue, specific thing, or not. We can join together and we can make a difference. So the question is not, do you feel the compassion deep inside of you? The question is, what do you do with it? And because I'm a pastor and I went to pastor school, I know that I have to leave you with a way to out, right? We had a 3-step program. It's going to be okay. First, we have to recognize the signs. We have to know that feeling inside of us, and we have to dig into what that feeling is. When I was standing in the Civil Rights Museum, I had to reckon with myself why it was I felt that way. Partially, it's because I have lived this life standing between two cultures myself, feeling both oppression and privilege simultaneously. I have sat across the table from friends who have told me their stories of racism that still exists today, and I have cried with them because it is real. And I had to dig into the fact that I am a clergy member. I was about to go into seminary, and I wanted to ask myself, what kind of clergy member are you going to be? Because Dr. Martin Luther King was writing to clergy members. He was a clergy member. I had to reconcile all of those things. We have to recognize what we are feeling. And when we recognize that feeling, we have to step into the story. Jesus didn't just walk over to people and be like, you're healed, and you're healed, and then just walk away. He entered into their stories. He asked questions. He heard what was on their hearts. He sat with people. That is what we are called to do. When we know this feeling inside of us, we can sit across the table from people and we can hear their story. We can do the research. And finally, friends, we must work the harvest. Jesus told his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And he tells his disciple, ask the Lord to give more workers. And we are to do the same thing. We are to ask the Lord to send people alongside of us that feel these things that we feel, to care for us and with us as we walk this process. But we are called into the harvest, my friends. We are the workers that Jesus was asking the disciples to pray for. And so as we go from this place, we have to remember that generations of the church have these same texts in front of them, these same promises from God, and these same struggles in the world around them. We are joining together to walk forward with compassion because he first loved us. So much that he sent his son in a manger to flip the world on its head. And so our only response when we say, oh, come, let us adore him, is to adore his compassion for others and to act on our own compassion. So this morning we ask ourselves not whether or not we're feeling it. I know we're all feeling it. But what are we going to do with the compassion that moves us literally to our bowels? How are we responding to that feeling? Let's pray. Good and gracious God, you are alive and at work. You are the same today that you have always been. And as you sent your Son to be the light of the world, God, you also sent us. And as we go out this morning and as we sing this last song, God, would you move in us? Would you allow us to see the ways that the world is broken around us and give us the community and the tools that we have to enter into that brokenness? In your holy and precious name we pray. Amen.
All right. We're going to close a song with a song that we've done before that really gets to the heart. What are we going to do? What are we going to do with what you just heard? And so I want to encourage you to stand as we close with prayers.
Perfect love, you need
As we close this morning, I just have two announcements for you. Before this service, we did a follow-up conversation about anti-trafficking. We know that the Super Bowl is coming, and that's a pivotal time for our community to be able to educate and build awareness. And so Laura Mulliken was with us from Source Ministries and was able to encourage us and give a lot of opportunities for response in this area. And if you weren't able to be there, or if you're interested, I would love to talk with you. Tom Watkins would love to talk with you. There's a group from our church that's going to move forward into that, and we would love to have you along. So we know that this is an issue in our community. We want to be responsive to it. But one of the things Laura said was that the number one thing you can do as a church is give people a healthy identity in Christ and to build strong and healthy relationships. And I loved hearing that from her because it's so at the heart of what we do. Next week, in a celebration of Christmas, is our all-church Christmas party. And it's an opportunity for us to hang out together and to build relationships. As you saw the kids up front, we get to all hang out together, eat some Christmas treats, hear some Christmas music. We're going to build gingerbread house nativities. Because, if you're out of elementary school, when do you get a chance to do something like that? So come up early next week and join us for that time. We're looking forward to it.
Friends, the Advent season is a crazy, crazy season, but the only thing that I would love for you to walk out of this room remembering is that Jesus came for you. And he called you out into the world to be his light. So as you are the light in this Advent season, remember the God who sent his son for you. Have a great week.
Thank you.